So once again, we thank you for joining us here at the Rural FASD Speaker Series. We are absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Karen Moore. Karen is someone that we have been working with and collaborating with for several years now, and is known internationally as one of the foremost experts as it pertains to permanency, as it pertains to developmental trauma, and several other things that she'll be dealing with here today. From our own perspective, we are absolutely thrilled to be here. Our audience has been waiting a long time to hear this presentation, Karen, because we certainly know firsthand the impacts that developmental trauma has on our children. So thank you for joining us, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. I am equally honored to be here and add some thoughts and some knowledge to the collective wisdom here. Before I get started, let me tell you that I don't come here as an expert. I come here as someone walking the walk with all of you, both professionally and personally. And so I bring some knowledge and some ideas to this conversation. But the magic comes when we share our ideas and knowledge together, and that's how we create change. So I hope this morning you will feel like the next 45 minutes or an hour or so that we spend together is worthwhile to you. That's the goal. And that you leave with either a few pieces of information that you didn't know before, or maybe a reminder of things that you knew and kind of forgot in the chaos of life. A little bit about myself before we get going. I am a registered social worker, and I have worked most of my career in child youth mental health, specializing in trauma, permanency, adoption, and violence issues. I am someone who has a private practice, and in that private practice in Lanark County, I specialize in permanency issues. When I say permanency, I mean adoption, foster care, kinship care, customary care, any of those versions of permanency that can offer children lifelong family. I also, as Rob talked about, do some training internationally, trying to make change in the world that we all live in. And most importantly, more importantly than any of that, I have the privilege of being the mom of 4 amazing young people, and our family was formed through permanency. So I walk the walk and I talk the talk, hopefully more often than not. This presentation today, I want to honor the expertise of Kathy Soden and Madison Lee and Sylvia Gibbons and the Developmental Trauma Action Alliance members who help inform this presentation. So their knowledge and wisdom is part of this as well. So what you'll see is I am completely technologically unskilled. So we are hoping that I will be able to move this presentation through the slides as we need to, and even make the video work. So if we can do that, it is a successful day. So we'll see how we go. The other thing you're going to see is I don't work linearly, and this presentation is in one way, and you're going to see me moving back and forth between the slides because that's how I work. So for those of you who like to go in a linear fashion, I apologize to you already. You are not going to like the way I present. So let's try and make this work together, okay? We're going to come back to the science in a minute around the brain and brain science. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about developmental trauma, okay? And what is developmental trauma and why are we going to talk about it? So I want to start with the video because if the video can work, we are golden. So let's start with the video and see. And this video, I want you to experience and hear and feel what it feels like to be in the world experiencing developmental trauma, okay? This video is only about 4 minutes long. For those of you who have living experience with developmental trauma or any kind of traumatic experiences, this is a sensory-based video. And so I just want you to kind of put your wall up a little bit and protect yourself. There's nothing violent, there's nothing scary from that perspective, but your body may feel it from a sensory perspective. Okay, so let's see how this goes. Oh, it looks good. At least the screen changed. Can you hear it? Alrighty. So that is what it feels like to live with developmental trauma. That experience, for those of us who don't have developmental trauma, of walking through that forest and experiencing a lovely experience, the colors, the sound. Many of us walk through nature to try and relax and to try and be calm. For someone with developmental trauma, that walking through that forest, doing everyday kinds of things, can feel like the struggle. You can be walking down the hall at school, and that music, that experience can be playing in your head. You can be doing something like sitting at the table with your family, having a lovely family dinner. And for them, if there's a trigger for them, that's how it feels like, walking through the forest with that difficult music, that impending doom kind of sense. Okay, I want you to keep that in your head as we start to learn about developmental trauma, because I don't just want you to experience it in your head. Okay, I want you to learn about it in your head, but I want you to feel it in your heart, because it's that feeling in your heart, that empathy, that being able to experience it, that's really going to give you the energy to be able to move forward in integrating some of the strategies we're going to talk about in a little while. It's not knowing it in your head that's going to make that happen. It's feeling it in your heart. So remember that music, okay? With developmental trauma, we often get lots of different diagnoses or labels attached. So it may be ADD or ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, reactive attachment disorder, PTSD, ASD. Some of the other ones you may hear about are bipolar or borderline personality disorder. So many of the children and youth that we either have the privilege of parenting or the privilege of working with, or both, when they've experienced developmental trauma, when they go to get help with from medical professionals, because developmental trauma is actually not a diagnosable experience at this point, although more doctors are starting to include it in their diagnosis, you will often see these kinds of diagnoses being given. It doesn't mean that our kids don't have ASD, for example, or FASD, or PTSD or ADHD, but it also doesn't mean that they only have those things. And what we also know is that when we work to heal developmental trauma, sometimes the symptoms of some of these other diagnoses get minimized. So it's an important thing to kind of keep track of. So we don't want to dismiss these, but we also want to recognize that if your child or youth or young adult has a history that we're going to talk about in a minute, then developmental trauma may very well be part of the journey. And sometimes it's a forgotten part of the journey. Okay. So what is developmental trauma? Developmental trauma is trauma, particularly in the first 3 years of life, that leads to profound changes in our brain and body. And I want you to think about that for a second. I want you to hear that these are changes to the body and the brain that are actually part of the physicalness of our being. Okay, so we actually can see changes in the brain chemistry, changes in the way that the brain looks and the way that the brain works. Interestingly, we also know that that's what FASD does to the brains of the children that we have the privilege of parenting or working with. And so we need to think about the compounding reality of developmental trauma and FASD, prenatal exposure to drugs or alcohol. Okay. The changes from developmental trauma can affect things like lifelong relationships, mental and physical health, learning, living, and parenting. And that process is called developmental trauma. So the reality of trauma that happens particularly in those first 3 years of life changes the way that the brain understands, processes, and incorporates experiences, especially things around relationships. Okay. So with developmental trauma, we are coming from a different perspective. So we want to change the perspective of what is wrong with you to what happened to you doesn't define you. Okay, that's a really important change. And I think when we talk about the work that we're all doing as well in around FASD, it's the same kind of process, right? It's not the sense of what's wrong with you. It's having an analysis and an understanding that difficult, hard things happen to you. And so because hard things happen to you, your experience in the world, the way that your brain processes information, has changed, and we have to figure out a way to manage that. We have to figure out a way to heal some of that, and we have to find a way to have strategies that will help you be the best person you can be. I want you to remember that video, right? I want you to remember that developmental trauma, especially in those first 3 years, incorporates that da 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 in many of the experiences that our kids have, and their brains remember that. And so many times what I say to families is, if you are, having an experience with your child or youth that doesn't make sense to you, that is not logical, you are more than likely dealing with a brain reaction that may be related to the prenatal exposure around FASD and may also be related to developmental trauma. So whenever it's illogical, I'm curious about that brain piece, okay? And the developmental trauma piece is a really important piece for us to include, okay? So I'm gonna go backwards on you now. Remember how I said I like to do this to you? So we're going back to the beginning, okay? What I want you to think about is that, and I've already told you that developmental trauma is not a formal diagnosis. There has been a movement to get it in the DSM to make it a formal diagnosis. That movement hasn't been successful yet. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, but we're already seeing professionals recognizing and acknowledging that developmental trauma exists in the lives of the children and youth that we have the privilege of parenting. We really need to be able to understand developmental trauma and what it looks like and what it is, so that we can have that framework of changing from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and how can we support you because of what happened to you. Also want you to recognize that this can be a tough topic. For those of us who are on this parenting journey, talking about what happened to our kids before they came to us can be really, really hard, especially if we're having a hard time with our kids right now and we are in a painful place. Talking about developmental trauma can be hard. So please take care of yourself. Know that there may be some triggering pieces in this presentation, and reach out. And that's why we've got that question and answer all the way through. Please put it in the chat, and also the ability to have that conversation after and really look at ways that we can support ourselves as we're learning this, okay? The key message I want you to leave here, if you leave with nothing else, I want you to leave with two things, actually. I want you to leave remembering that music and remembering and thinking about what we ask our kids to do to manage that kind of experience every day and still be successful. And I want to leave you with the message of healing and hope, but I want that message of hope to be realistic. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Right. So why is developmental trauma important? Number one, because our kids are often misunderstood, right? They're often seen through those labels that we talked about earlier, and the lack of understanding that what happened to our kids early in life has impacted and changed their brains, both prenatally through prenatal experience around drugs and alcohol, as well as through trauma. So for kids who are on a permanency journey, the fact that they are on that permanency journey is a cause of trauma. Okay, the actual issue of not being with original parents and needing to be placed with another family is trauma in and of itself. And so we need to have that additional piece if we're walking a permanency journey to understand that among many other pieces of trauma that our kids may have experienced, the permanency journey is one of them, okay? We have to try and understand developmental trauma because behavior is often misunderstood. It's often decoded incorrectly or translated incorrectly, and it's usually in a negative way. And so each time our kids' behavior is decoded or translated in a negative way, it affects their internal working model, their sense of themselves. It also impacts their sense of their caregivers or other people in the world. And in our healing of that, we want to actually change those perspectives. And so we really need to be able to translate or decode behavior in a different way. Kids and youth and adults for that matter, with developmental trauma are often not being well served by the systems they interact with. If you talk to, children's mental health agencies, you talk to medical professionals, educators, recreation services, they often don't know anything about developmental trauma. And so if they don't know about it, it's hard for them to actually do anything about it. So that's one of the reasons why we're trying to get this word out as much as we possibly can, because we need people to understand our kids. We need them to translate that behavior correctly so that we can actually understand what they need rather than consequence them for what we think they've done, okay? And kids need to be better understood, and they need to feel understood. So it's not just a matter of us thinking we get it. We have to find a way to be able to communicate that to them so that they know that we get it, okay? So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences are the forms of trauma that we're talking about. They are the things that happen to our kids primarily before the age of 3. But developmental trauma can also be issues that happen after the age of 3, but we're specifically thinking about before the age of 3 because that's when so many important pieces of development happen in the brain. Issues around safety, issues around relationship, attachment, all of those things are well established by the age of 3. And so if we have kids who've experienced trauma or multiple traumas, that's what's affecting that brain development. Okay, so if you look on here, you can see that it's divided into 3 sections. Abuse is the first section. So whether it's physical abuse to that child, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, those are forms of trauma, okay, and types of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. If the child experienced physical or emotional neglect, this common column, that should not have been so hard to say. This column also is really important for us when we're parenting kids on permanency journeys, because we may have kids who, in their experience with their birth families tried to meet their needs, but just weren't able. So they may be because of addictions issues, because of their own mental health issues, or because they were misunderstanding the cues that the child was giving them, i.e. the child was crying because they were dirty and the parent kept misunderstanding that and kept trying to feed them, or the child was hungry and the parent kept trying to change them. So we may have had parents who were trying really hard but couldn't do it. That fits into an adverse childhood experience under the neglect category, okay? And then this title of household dysfunction, I don't like this title. If I would to change this, I don't have the power with the CDC to change their language, but if I could, this would be the suggestion I would have. Under household issues, if we have a parent or a caregiver or someone living with a child who has mental health issues or mental illness, if we have a caregiver, this says mother treated violently, if we have a child who's witnessed violence in the home, if parents separate or divorce, if they have a relative who is in custody, in jail, incarcerated, or if they have a caregiver who is experiencing substance abuse issues, okay? So when you think about the children that you have the privilege of parenting, how many of these adverse childhood experiences have they experienced, and how often did they experience it? Okay, so it's an important framework for us to have. What we know is that adverse childhood experiences are actually more common than we may think. So in a study of adults done by the CDC, you can see that 12.5% of the adult population that were part of this study, and they've been able to suggest that this can be generalized across the adult population. 12.5% of the population have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So those are those experiences that we just talked about that happen before the age of 3. In a minute, you'll find out why these are relative, okay, why this is important. Remember, we've talked about if you experience those adverse childhood experiences, those traumas before the age of 3, you can experience developmental trauma. You can experience the fact that your brain is not able to form the way that it was supposed to. And so the brain has been physically impacted by experiencing those adverse childhood experiences, okay? What we also know is that the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the higher the risk is for you to have some of the outcomes that we're going to talk about in a minute. Before I get to that slide, though, I want to highlight for you that we're talking about an increased risk, not an absolute. Okay. And so what we know, and this is where that hope and healing part is that I was talking about earlier, what we know is that with some of the strategies and interventions we're going to talk about later, we can mitigate those risks. Okay. We can help to create new ways for the brain to experience things. We can heal the brain. We can't get rid of the pathways that the brain already established in that unhealthy way. But what we can do through some of these interventions and strategies is we can encourage the brain to create new pathways, okay? Because of brain plasticity, because we know of how amazing the brain is now to be able to create those new pathways, these adverse childhood experiences mean that the brain has been changed. There is a risk, and the risk gets higher with the number of adverse childhood experiences. And with interventions and with healing experiences, we can help mitigate some of those risks by creating new pathways. Okay, I want you to hear both of those messages as we continue. So in schools, what we know this would be supposedly a typical number of kids in a classroom. I think sometimes our classrooms are a little bit bigger than this, but let's not get into that conversation right now. When you look at a classroom based on the data, you can see that you are going to have a significant number of students who are in that classroom with a number of adverse childhood experiences. And remember what I said, the number of adverse childhood experiences, the more that you have, the more risk you are at some of the behaviors and needs that we're going to talk about in a minute. So when you look at a typical classroom, you can see that there's a significant number of kids who have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Okay, that's something that we need to think about. It's also something that we need to remember when we're talking to and advocating with our education partners, for them to be able to have that context. And this slide can come in really helpful to be able to advocate when you're having conversations with your education partners, which we'll talk about again in a minute. So before we talk about these risks, I want you to hear again, remember, this is only a risk. This is not an absolute, and we can create new pathways. But what we do know is that the possible risk outcomes for people who have significant adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma, we can see that there's a lack of physical activity, a lack of self-care, an increase in the use of smoking, increase alcoholism, drug use, and increase issues with employment around missed work, not showing up, not being able to be present, maybe because of some of those other issues, right? Potentially if there's alcohol or drug use, that may impact the ability to attend work regularly. We also know that with an increased number of adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma, there's an increased risk, a possible increased risk for severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted infections, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. And the reason for this is because we know that, number one, the brain has been changed, and number two, trauma affects the body's way of being able to manage and process things that the body needs to be able to process, right? And so we're at higher risk for some of these issues if we have a significant trauma background, especially if we are not taking care of ourselves because of that trauma history, right? And so we have that interrelatedness, that we have that early adverse childhood experiences, that developmental trauma that impacts the way that we see ourselves in the world and the way that we impact the way that we are in the world. It changes the way that people interact with us. And so then we may not be in a position to take care of ourselves very well. We may use substances to be able to cope. And so then we're at higher risk for some of these physical and mental health issues. So they all interact and they're all combined, okay? So once again, this is another way to kind of see that last piece. Early adversity, also known as developmental trauma, also known as adverse childhood experiences, has lasting impacts. Without intervention, without healing, developmental trauma puts somebody at significant risk for all of these issues that we have on the slide and that we talked about earlier, okay? It doesn't mean that they will absolutely have these issues, but the more trauma they are exposed to, especially before the age of 3, the more adverse childhood experiences, the more the brain has been developed in a way to cope with those adverse childhood experiences, the higher the risk that they will have these realities as part of their adolescence and early adulthood and adulthood life, okay? The other piece, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to see that adverse childhood experiences have a context, right? They are part of a world that we all live in, and the roots to some of those or all of those adverse childhood experiences, if you see the tree as those adverse childhood experiences, you can see the roots to that tree are things like poverty, historical trauma, violence, intergenerational trauma, which you probably hear about a lot. When you understand developmental trauma and adverse childhood experiences, you can then understand intergenerational trauma. Why we have families that have challenges and concerns from one generation to another generation to another generation, because without healing, without intervention, Those are the roots. Intergenerational trauma experiences are the roots of the tree. And so that's why we have families that from generation to generation to generation struggle with things around addictions and trauma, et cetera, okay? We also need to think about the fact that the tree gets its energy, gets its strength, if you will, from those roots. And if those roots are strong, then we have less chance of adverse childhood experiences, right? If we have roots that are filled with, you know, access to resources, living in a safe environment, having good food, having healthy housing, our chances of some of those adverse childhood experiences happening are minimized, okay? We also need to think about the environment that tree is growing in. And we need to think about some of the environmental issues that are happening right now. And a perfect example of that is the pandemic, right? So the pandemic puts additional stress on that tree and may cause some of those adverse childhood experiences and may be more damaging if that tree doesn't have really strong roots, right? That pandemic, that wind of the pandemic, if you will, can really put a lot of pressure on those adverse childhood experiences, can increase the risk of adverse childhood experiences, especially if the roots are not strong, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit more about some brain science. Let me say to start off with, I am no brain expert. There are some amazing brain experts out there, and you'll see in the presentation, if you want to learn a lot more about the brain, you're going to go to them, not me. But we are going to be able to do some beginning understanding of why trauma, especially in those early years, affects and changes the way that the brain develops, okay? So what we know is, and we've already talked about, that biological impact of those adverse childhood experiences on the body and the brain. And that's how those issues either, quote unquote, get under the skin, right? They actually change the chemicals in the body. So what they do, those traumas, those adverse childhood experiences, they cause an excess activation of the stress response systems in that child's developing brain, as well as the immune system, the metabolic system, and the cardiovascular system. Remember, those systems are developing and growing as that baby, that infant, that toddler, that young child is growing. That if there's an experience or multiple experiences of trauma or adverse childhood experiences, those experiences change the chemical input that happens to that body in those systems that are developing at the time. Okay, experiencing those adverse childhood experiences or those traumas triggers all of those interacting stress response systems. So what ends up happening is when a child experiences multiple adverse childhood experiences over time, especially if they don't have a supporting relationship with an adult to provide buffering. We're going to talk about this in a minute, okay? The experiences will trigger an excessive and lifelong stress response, which can cause wear and tear on the body. It's like revving a car engine for days or weeks at a time, okay? When you remember back to that video, that da-da-da-da, 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 when you heard that video, your body went and had a stress response. Depending on your own life experiences, your experience to that video may have been less or more. But if you think about, if that's the way you walk in the world, that's the way your body experiences. You are at a high level of stress all the time. And that high level of stress can impact your body's way of being able to cope physically and emotionally, and it takes a toll. Remember, this says, especially without supportive relationships with adults who provide the buffering protection. That's the piece we're going to talk about in a little bit, about how we heal and how we protect kids, even if they've had developmental trauma and early adverse childhood experiences. That adult interaction, that relational piece is what's going to heal. For our kids who are on permanency journeys, they often did not have that healthy, supportive relationship with an adult to help buffer. And so not only did they experience those adverse childhood experiences or those traumas, but they were left alone to try and manage them and try to understand them. The challenge with that is that that taught their brains that they weren't safe, and it taught their brains that caregivers were not necessarily going to be there to keep them safe. And so those are two messages that get implanted in those brain systems that for those of us who are parenting kids and youth on trauma journeys, on permanency journeys, we see those messages come up sometimes, right? We see those memories come into our interactions with our kids, even if we have done an amazing job of helping them heal. Remember, we don't get rid of those old pathways. We create new pathways in times of stress, in times of crisis, or in times of developmental change. Our kids can revert back to some of those old brain pathways sometimes, okay? All right, so this is just a visual to give you a different sense of chronic trauma can move to a chronic stress response. It's just a different way of being able to see what the words were telling us earlier. But there's another piece in here that I just want to point out to you. We can have kids who have digestion issues, have physical issues related to their stress response. So oftentimes our kids have digestion issues, they have sensory issues, they get triggered by certain things, they may have issues around taste and texture, and all of those can come from that chronic trauma and then chronic stress response. So if you have a child or a youth who has chronic physical issues, it's important to think about and decode some of those things from a physical place and also from a prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol, as well as a developmental trauma perspective. Because remember, chronic trauma, especially early in life, can impact the body's physical reality. And we're also talking about, even if we have a child, let's say they've experienced those significant adverse childhood experiences in the first 18 months, the first 2 years, the first 2.5 years, and then they move into an experience of calm and connection. The brain has already developed in that place of chaos. Okay, in that place of trauma, in that place of adverse childhood experiences. Moving to a place of calm and safety will help to protect the brain from creating more of those disconnected pathways, those unhealthy pathways. But those unhealthy pathways in those first few years of life still stay in the brain. Okay, it's important to remember that. So if you want to learn more about brain science, I would highly, highly, highly recommend the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative has a brain story course. It's free. It has tons of Canadian content and up-to-date content, and it really helps us understand the impact of trauma and adverse childhood experiences on the brain, and helps us understand some strategies as well as lifelong health issues. So if you want to access more information about this, I would highly recommend it. Like I said, it's free, it's online, and it's comprehensive. I think don't quote me here, but I think there's like 12 or 15 modules. Maybe more information than you ever wanted to know about the brain, but maybe not, maybe exactly what you need to know. So we're going to see if this video works. And if it doesn't, then you can just go to the website, but I hope it will work. Look at that, it might be working.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is the solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
All right, so that's an example of the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative and the information that it provides. I would, like I said, I would highly recommend it. And it really helps to put into perspective some of the pieces that we're talking about around developmental trauma and what we can do about it, okay? So there's the link if you want to take it. It's a certification course. You get certified as a brain builder, and it's free. And like I said, it's online, and it does take about 30 hours. So it's a bit of a commitment, but you don't have to do it all at once. And it really is full of some really great information. Okay. So here's some really important takeaways that we need to remember in adoption and permanency journeys. This is where the hope part comes in for those of you who are like, wow, this is a really great presentation there, Karen. Thanks for making me feel better. We're moving into hope here, okay? The first piece is we need to know that brains keep being built up to the age of 25 plus, okay? We know that actually brains change all throughout our lives now, but there's significant brain building happening up to the age of 25. We also know that the brain is particularly active in certain developmental stages for that executive functioning, that piece where that air traffic controller, that place where our kids who have developmental trauma or FASD, most of our kids, if they have FASD, will have developmental trauma as well. There are two areas or time frames where executive functioning is really focused in the developing brain. The first one is 3 to 5 years. And for some of us, we miss that, right? If our kids come to us after that. But then there's another stage of 15 to 25 years where at the age of between 15 and 25, the brain is really focusing and really building up those executive functioning skills. So that's a huge window for us, especially if our kids come to us a little bit later in life and or if we have kids with prenatal exposure, FASD, and or developmental trauma, okay? So when we are talking about some of our kids, that time between, it seems to be between 18 and 25, significant for integrating and understanding some of the lessons that you may have been trying to teach them early in life and think that maybe they never got or they never will. We can see some significant change in that later part of that 15 to 25 age range, where the brain is building those skills. And then it seems by the age of about 21 to 25-ish, you can actually start to see some integration and use of those skills, okay? We have the ability to prune those pathways. Remember, I talked about those pathways earlier on, and build new pathways all the way through the life cycle of the brain, okay? So this is not, oh, we missed the window, we're done. This can continually be lifelong learning. And what we know is that if kids have relationship stability, and relationship stability related to the brain, studies have shown that with therapeutic support, with a strong relationship, those cortisol levels can move back to and resemble normal levels, and that inflammation, that damage can go down, okay? So the relationship that you have with your kids, the connection that you have with your kids can change their brains, can literally change and heal their brains. So when you're feeling overwhelmed and exhausted and thinking, I don't know if I can do this anymore, like I don't know why I'm so tired, it's because you're changing their brains. Okay, you're not just fighting about or having a disagreement about the fact that they missed curfew, or that they didn't pick that code up for the 100th time, or that they were being rude, or that they were, you know, forgetting some of the lessons that you taught them. You're not just doing that, you're actually healing and changing their brains. So no wonder you're tired. Of course you're tired, okay? Want to highlight that those ACEs are not destiny, okay? They are not a prescription to say this will happen. They are an ability for us to say there's a higher risk because of those adverse childhood experiences. And the toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma, they're all the same thing. We just call them all these lovely terms, but they all mean the same thing. The higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, or the higher the number of developmental trauma experiences, the higher somebody is at risk for those challenges. And we can still impact that with healthy relationship and connection and all of the things we're going to talk about in a minute, okay? The experience and the impact of ACEs and toxic stress is where the trauma comes in, okay? That trauma is the impact that ACEs or toxic stress has on the brain and the body, okay? So we've done this part. See how I said to you, we're going to bop back and forth? You're welcome. So development, what we know is that, if we have repeated trauma early in life, it affects development. We have scientific proof about that those repeated traumas, especially in those first 3 years, will affect the development of the brain. And if the brain is affected, all of the other pieces of that child are affected, right? Because we need the brain to manage our walking, our talking, our social skills, our executive functioning, our ability to learn how to ride a bike, our ability to learn how to feed ourselves, our ability to know when we need to go to the bathroom. All of those things are controlled by the brain. And so trauma can affect every single thing that a person thinks or does, okay? But it doesn't have to. Okay, so Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is one of the people that has done a lot of work around developmental trauma. And he speaks about these 7 puzzle pieces of developmental trauma and the reality that developmental trauma is all encompassing, right? So developmental trauma affects the ability of a person to be able to have an attached relationship, the ability for the person to be able to have emotional regulation, be able to regulate their behavior, how they feel about themselves, how they learn, if they're able to stay present or if they need to dissociate, and all of those things somatically and sensorily around what their body feels and how they experience the world through their body. Okay, so developmental trauma affects the whole being, physically and emotionally. So if we have trauma early on in life that's been repeated and it occurs early in life, those adverse childhood experiences that we talked about before, it affects the development. And what it does is it forces the brain to adapt. It forces the brain to adapt to what is going on in that child's life. So it forces the child, for example, to adapt to dealing with family violence, or dealing with a parent with mental health issues, or with substance abuse issues, or with poverty, or all of those things that we talked about. And because it forces that adaptation, it changes the way the brain is built. Okay, so that's how it happens. It's actually brilliant, because what ends up happening is the brain says, I'm living in an environment, I need to change the way that I'm going to grow so that I can be the most successful in this environment, so I can stay safe. The most important part for the brain is to keep that person alive. And so the brain will change itself and will adapt for survival. Okay, so it's brilliant, except it then means that when that child is in a healthy environment, or when that child moves into the rest of the world in daycare or school, and there's expectations around norm development, their brain is at a disadvantage because their brain has been adapted to that maladaptive environment or that challenged environment, those adverse childhood experiences. Okay. We don't have time for that one, so I'll tell you about that after. Okay. So with a developmental trauma lens or perspective, we want to move from I am bad. We want to move from the child thinking I'm bad, or their caregivers or the adults that come into their lives seeing them as bad. We want to move to this place of acceptance. And when I say acceptance, I mean it from a place of understanding that the brain has been changed. And we need to accept that that brain has been changed, and that with healing, with relationship, we may be able to make some significant changes to that brain, but we may not be able to heal all that it has adapted to. So there may be pieces that we're not going to be able to change, or not change as much as we may wish we can. Okay, that's what that acceptance piece is. That's what that hope piece is. Okay, we have to have hope and acceptance that's realistic. We don't want to limit the possibility of our kids. We don't want to see them as not being able to or not being competent, but at the same time, we also don't want to have unrealistic expectations based on the fact that their brain chemistry and their brain has adapted, and they may not be able to do all we wish that they can do. In that acceptance, that means as permanency parents, we have to do our grieving. And we have to experience the loss of knowing that because of developmental trauma and because our kids' brains have been changed, they may not be all they could have been if they had not experienced that trauma. That's a painful thing for us to accept. It's a painful thing for us to acknowledge. And it's really a painful thing sometimes for us to live with. And it's essential for us to do so that we can move to the place of the child believing, maybe I'm not so bad. Maybe I'm actually not a bad person. Maybe this is about how my brain reacts and works. And we as caregivers can move to a place of, maybe I can begin to trust you. Maybe I can understand how your brain works so that I don't have unrealistic or hopeful expectations that are not expectations that you can meet. If my expectations are realistic for your brain, then I'm going to have a much more healthy and positive relationship with you, okay? Easier said than done. I know, I walk the journey with you. So what we know, I'm just checking the time here. Oh my goodness, I got 2 minutes. I'm gonna take a couple extra minutes. I'm gonna go through this quickly, and you'll be able to see the PowerPoints on all of the various medias, and they're pretty self-explanatory. But I wanna spend some time quickly in talking about the fact that what we can do to help heal and manage these high ACE scores, this developmental trauma, is things like ensuring good sleep, good nutrition, exercise, mindfulness, nurturing relationships. One of the biggest factors that we know of being able to help people manage developmental trauma is for them to be in relationship with people who love them unconditionally, which doesn't mean we don't have limits and boundaries. What it means is that we are there for them always and forever, even if we can't physically be there. For some of our kids, their behaviors are at such an extreme need that they may not be able to live with us. That doesn't mean we still can't be connected to them in relationship. That is the key piece to helping the brain heal and continue on a healing path. Even when that brain puts our kids or youth in difficult positions, even when that brain causes our kids to make decisions that are difficult or painful for us, if we can still maintain relationship with them, that is the key, okay? Not easy to do always. That's why things like this group are really powerful, accessing mental health support, being connected with people who get it. Those are the things that are going to keep us as caregivers healthy and connected and strong so that we can maintain ourselves in being that unconditionally connected person for our kids, even when their brains are having them do things that are illogical, hurtful, crazy, painful, okay? The focus is on the relationship. What we know is that relationships heal relationship trauma. Developmental trauma is all about relationships that have caused pain and trauma and changed the brain chemistry for the brain to adapt to try and be able to experience that trauma, okay? What we know is that relationships, healthy, strong relationships, heal relationship trauma. And what we also know is when we heal developmental trauma, we help prevent developmental trauma from happening again. So we stop that intergenerational cycle. If we can heal that brain, we can minimize the impact that that brain will then have on that, if they have a child, their child's brain, and we can stop that intergenerational cycle, okay? So what that means for us, especially on adoption and permanency journeys, is we really need to think about stability. We need to think about reducing chaos and trauma. We need to think about relationship first. So we really need to think about some of the things that we may get into power struggles with our kids about, homework, etc. We really need to think, will this positively affect my relationship with my child? If so, I'm going to go with it. If not, then you really have to question, is this worth it? Because we always want the relationship to be first, okay? We want to provide opportunities to build those new pathways, and those pathways are built in loving connection, repetition, being able to have that child experience things over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. That time where you think, we've done this 100 times, you probably have to do it 1,000 times more, because that is what's building that pathway in the brain, okay? We want to think about ways that we can calm that stress response system, because remember that developmental trauma has created that chronic stress. And so anytime we can minimize that stress, anytime that we can provide our kids strategies or places to be able to contain that stress, will help us to help that brain not go to that stress response, okay? Not hear that music in the forest, okay? If we can calm their stress response, if we can get them out of fight, flight, or freeze, that's when we're actually going to be able to make those relational connections. If our kids are in that stress place, if they're in fight, flight, or freeze, the only thing we can do for them is be in relationship with them and let them know they're not alone, and we're going to keep them safe or make sure that they are safe. Their brain can process nothing else until it's back to being regulated, okay? So that's understanding our kids and being able to build that sense of belonging and identity for them. That idea that they're not bad. We want to create that new identity for them, that their brains may work differently because of developmental trauma, because of prenatal exposure to drugs or alcohol. And That doesn't mean that their brains are any less important or that they are any less important than anybody else. When you think about the fact that their brains have actually been that resilient, it's profoundly amazing to think about what their brains have done to be able to manage and survive those adverse childhood experiences, right? And remember that they are still experiencing the effects of some of those things, moving into school, moving into friend relationships, having a relationship with you. The one piece we also need to remember that as permanency caregivers, we represent the trauma of permanency. We represent that loss. If they did not lose their original parents, they would not have us. And so we literally personify that loss to them. We also personify the hope that we are actually going to be there forever. And we also personify the fear that they're actually going to lose us like they've lost their original family. So you need to also recognize and remember that sometimes in your interaction with your kids, they aren't seeing you, they're seeing what you personify. And so one of the really important pieces that we can do in this journey of healing is try really hard to not take things personally, because 9 times out of 10, it's actually not about us. It's about the trauma. It's about the developmental stage. It's about what we personify. And so my friends at Never Too Late, which is a program at the Adoption Council of Ontario that works with finding permanency for older youth and adults, this idea that it's never too late for permanency. One of their key phrases is Q-tip, and that stands for quit taking it personally. One of the ways that you're really going to be able to stay in relationship with your child, even when they're trying to push buttons, is to not take it personally. And that will help you to stay focused. It will help you to stay grounded, and it will help you not get into that stress response. Because if you get into a stress response, their brain's going to match it, and we're going to end up back into that forest. And if they are in that forest, they cannot hear or see anything that you're trying to do with them. Okay? Okay. Kids and adults with developmental trauma are not giving you a hard time. They are having a hard time. If you can remember that reframe, even in the hardest of times, that will help you not take it personally. And it will help you to remember that in the hard times, you're actually creating new pathways. You are changing their brains. And that is why it is so damn hard, because you are literally changing the brain of that child you have the privilege of being the parent to. Okay. Here you're going to see some resources. Kathy Soden at the Adoption Council of Ontario spearheaded a group called the Developmental Trauma Action Alliance. They do some amazing work around developmental trauma. Here's all links for you to be able to see those resources. Here's some other resources and links to the ACEs study, to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's work. There's a TED Talk about how childhood trauma affects health across a lifetime. Really great. A book on the deepest well. There's that Alberta Family Wellness that I talked about. So some really great resources. And once again, here's some more around developmental trauma, ACEs, and brain resources. So lots of places where you can get information, okay? So I hope you got a nugget or two out of that. We could talk about this for days, or I could talk about this for days. I tried to keep it relatively within the hour. I went a little bit over, but that's how it goes. And so we're going to stop with the presentation now, and we will move into the question and answer. So if you have questions, please get them there. We'll try and answer as many as we can, and we'll try and make this as helpful and as alive for you as we can. So we'll go to the other room.
Thank you very much, Karen. This was absolutely wonderful presentation. I think my main takeaway from what you were sharing with us is very much that idea of realistic hope and recognizing that there's a lot of factors that are at play here, and knowing that our children, we always get the best version of our children that they can provide us. And when we look at some of the things that they're dealing with, it is absolutely amazing to see their level of perseverance and resiliency. So once again, thank you very much. And to our studio audience, we will be back next month speaking about the environmental scan report that the rural FASD has recently completed in the counties of Lanark and Leeds-Grenville. So till then, be safe, and we'll see you then.